Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 150 and a webinar on the COVID-19 pandemic and Australian higher education. So today from around the world, we contemplate the issues and problems of a very well managed system, very successful national system, Australia, with 7 universities in the Shanghai Jiaotong top 100. And a stellar reputation for international education at scale, especially in Asia, facing the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit it as a national system way harder than most others. Australia is able to cut itself off geographically, so it can stop inward flights, and that's so slow the danger of infection from abroad during the pandemic. And of course, the country from time to time, both nationally and regionally, has taken those options. But that, of course, disrupts international student mobility very badly. And Australia is a country with about 25% of its income of its higher education institutions coming from the international education market, with about 1/3 of its students in a normal year, international students. So the pandemic is, in the short and medium term, quite transformative and raises serious questions about financial sustainability, which we hope, those of us friends of Australia around the world, hope that the Australian government is attending to with zeal and care. But our speakers will tell us about that. And we've got today Margaret Gardner, President at Monash University in Melbourne, Laurie Pearcey, the Pro Vice Chancellor International from New South Wales, and Professor Fazal Rizvi, who's also from Melbourne. And we'll take our speakers in that order. Let me quickly, though, run through the web protocols for you. Remember that the webinar is being recorded, so your words of wisdom during the chat and during the Q&A will be immortalised on our website in the next 24 hours or so. Colleagues in Australia will be pleased, those who can't attend now, because it's now 11 o'clock in the eastern states of Australia, that the webinar will be available on YouTube soon. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. We find that composing the questions in the chat function first is the process that works best in terms of putting together the Q&A. So put your question into the chat and I will select you out, and I'll give you a warning in the chat that you're about to be brought into the webinar to ask your question. When you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself. Most important, we always forget this from time to time using Zoom. Switch on your video and state your name and where you are from, and then ask your question. Well, it gives me great pleasure to invite into the webinar now Margaret Gardner. Margaret is the President and Vice Chancellor of Monash University, and previously was the President and Vice Chancellor of RMIT University in Melbourne, and she's held leadership positions in Queensland and at Griffith University, which is where she was when I first met her, I think, when I was doing a case study of Griffith University some years ago. She's the interim chair of the group of 8 universities. That's the leading research universities in Australia, and was chair of Universities Australia, which is the overarching body that covers all universities between 2017 and 2019. She has a distinguished record as a scholar as well as a university leader, and you can see a fuller biography in the announcement of today's webinar on our website. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for the invitation to speak. Let me begin by saying that, as I think all of us in universities around the world have found, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been all-consuming, so to speak, and its impacts have been diverse and, as I said, being felt in almost every aspect of the university's operation. In Australia in particular, because of when the pandemic hit, the impact on Australian universities was immediate in a way I think that has come to the Northern Hemisphere in a slightly different form, because of course we work on a calendar year. And so if we look to the beginning of this year, and it seems so long ago now, in Australia, those of us particularly on the eastern coast saw the year open with major bushfires. And certainly there were bushfires burning out the conflagration across the eastern part of the state of Victoria, in which Monash is located, or Monash's headquarters are located, Australian campuses are located. And just as we responded to that, you know, what should we do to help in that crisis? What should we do for our students and staff who are volunteering in bushfires and being affected by the crisis if they lived in those areas? Come the end of that month, the pandemic had struck. My own university convened its crisis management team, which had been in a particular form around the bushfires, went into full-blown operation, if you like, from the end of January. And we have been under a crisis management situation from January 26th of this year. And that is the story, the story of the year. So a whole series of things happened quite quickly. People didn't fully understand the pandemic. In Australia's case, it was one of the first nations to actually close its borders to China, and a significant proportion of our international students are from China. And then in relatively quick succession, all the international borders closed, and suddenly we're in a different form of lockdown. I like to say Australian universities on average, as many of you know, are quite large. And Monash is indeed the largest Australian university. We have well over 70,000 students. And I like to say that it felt like a very large elephant just lifted onto its ballet shoe and started pirouetting on the point with the speed. There was not, from the moment we started teaching, and we did our first week online as a sort of an introduction, because we'd shifted a number of other things, we moved everything online. There was not a day that we weren't operating, and we moved to fully online, and that meant everything changed. Without talking about what that meant for the education, which is just a massive wave of change, building on a whole range of ways that learning was already being innovated and blended. We already had significant parts of the flipped classroom. We already had significant online. Monash had all its exams online already before the pandemic. So we were helped a little, but I'd have to say it was a complete transformation. The impact economically on the universities of that border closure was, and has been estimated for the group of 8, for 2020 alone, to be an estimated $2.2 billion revenue reduction over those 8 universities. And that revenue reduction is almost inevitably caused all sorts of other changes to have to be made. But probably the thing that has been most felt in the group of 8 and universities like my own is because so much of that international student revenue was actually being spent, if you like, partly in the research endeavour, that the impact that we're foreseeing on research is really quite significant. So yes, of course, that loss of revenue will have an impact on any university if it's of that scale, and an immediate set of things happened. In our case, and not uncommon, senior management took pay cuts. We took 20% pay reductions. We negotiated a new deal with the unions for a variation as a way of trying to reduce the impact of that revenue reduction on the amount of staff loss. We cut our capital works, we spent our reserves, we lifted our borrowings, in other words, major transformation. But that research workforce and the estimates for the group of 8, there's a threat to the 10,000 plus research workforce. And we estimate that there are about 4,000 of that workforce on fixed term contracts that will end between December 2020 and March 2021. Now, they're not all going to disappear because a number of them are on external grants and some of those external grants will be renewed. But it is fair to say that well over 40% of the research expenditure in Group of 8 universities is supplied by the universities themselves, not by a granting agency. And so you can see, you know, that's quite a material and direct impact on that very significant part of what we do in terms of overall research capacity, apart from, of course, the impact of the general shrinking of revenue on overall quality. But probably its biggest first impact will be into the next year on research. I've talked about what has been done and what people are doing. There is a discussion going on with government about research funding reform, but as yet there has been no decision made at this time of the year about what that will look like, and the government has made no announcements. And the first time that there might be an announcement might be around the October budget. But as yet, that major impact on research funding has not been publicly addressed, although there are consultations going on. The Group of 8 itself has put out a proposal about how they believe research funding should be addressed into the future. And the reason I'm talking about research is to talk about the other things that are going on in the midst of this pandemic. So the Group of 8 has talked about how excellent research should be supported at scale to both retain and ensure the impact of the concentrations of excellence that exist, how we could better expand our engagement in translation in general across practice, not just commercialisation, but translation of research in company with other organisations and government, and how we might better capture and therefore hopefully support in the future the full economic costs of research. And we'll see how those proposals go and how the government responds to them. The reason I have raised those first is because of that impact, and to say that somewhat unusually in Australia, I've just set this scene. So the universities have pivoted. They have responded both to the economic impacts and to the need to deal with lockdown and various forms of restriction on their activities. And that response, if you like, on the educational and operational front in relation to our students and staff has actually, I think, given us a lot of things that we've learnt that will help as we think about how we continue to do what we do in education and research as we work our way out of this pandemic. But there are a series of other things happening in Australia. So the universities, you might think, are consumed with the reaction to pandemic, and we are, but the government has actually introduced a new piece of legislation, which is a transformation of the way our education would be funded for domestic students in Australia. It is a package which would is currently being debated in the upper house, in the Senate. In fact, only today I spoke to the Senate committee. So somewhat unusually, you might say, in the midst of a major crisis, we have in front of us a legislative package that would substantially change, and change dramatically, the way domestic education is dealt with. And there are a series of issues around that which go to its impacts on the overall funding of education, the overall funding of education and research in the country, the increases of substantial nature for some students, so greater inequities in the contributions to be made by students, significant potential extra regulation. It's actually a very big potential shift. And that is being debated as we speak. One of its aims is to provide places for what is not just the counter-cyclical impact of recession on demand for higher education. Any recession, demand for higher education goes up. But in Australia, the school-leaving population is growing demographically. So the demand for higher education is growing, and there were no extra places. So in part, this was to address the need for extra places, but it is doing so with no extra funding in the envelope. And so that means less funding per student place. So we're facing that particular funding change, a really major change, and therefore its implications for how we fund research in the future. But interestingly, Australia is also legislatively in the midst of, in terms of legislation and regulation, in terms of education, in the midst of this pandemic, not related to this pandemic, facing a whole series of other changes. And they are these. Like much of the Anglosphere, there's a set of arguments about what are key cultural issues that relate to how universities operate. Academic freedom, freedom of speech, foreign interference and influence, for example, matters of debate, as we know in the UK, the US and in Australia, and they have a particular flavour tied to national security in the case of foreign influence and foreign interference, questions of institutional trust about universities around questions about freedom of speech and academic freedom. Currently, Australian universities are also in the midst of a review of their academic freedom and freedom of speech policies against a model code that was developed last year. So that review is underway. There's a significant proposal for a change in the way universities will undertake their engagement with foreign governments, foreign entities and foreign universities in terms of their research collaborations, which is captured in a foreign relations bill, which is about allowing the Minister for Foreign Affairs significant power in terms of how they will deal with agreements and arrangements that are made before they are made and after they are made. So we are in the midst, I would have to say, of what have been often called, and it's become somewhat cliched, interesting times. You might expect, as I said, that the major things that are occupying us, and they are, is how do we manage the effects for our students, for their education, for the institutions so that they continue to provide quality education and quality research. And the pandemic has made all of that challenging. It's also challenged because it's fed into the closure of borders and one might call a general inward-looking trend in the way people are approaching the world. The lifeblood of universities, knowledge with no borders, international collaboration, international exchange, are all being challenged by the COVID pandemic, as well as being affected by elements of geopolitical uncertainty. And yes, we're feeling all of those and the economic effects. But we are actually also experiencing a level of legislative activism around a series of other issues about the role of universities, their autonomy, their independence, the trust that the society through its polity puts in them, are all being tested currently in Australia. I'd like to say that the COVID pandemic appears in most of the world to raise questions about how do we deal with situations like this, and what does this tell us about how we should reshape ourselves for a future where economies will change, where we know we will have potentially more pandemics in future driven by climate change and therefore the impacts on planetary health. So yes, we're asking those big questions and rising to those big challenges and looking at what we have learned about how quickly we can innovate, how flexible we really are, how amazingly adaptive, and what that tells us for the future. And they are all things of great optimism, from not just the way our staff pivoted, but the way our students pivoted. Their grades have gone up. Their satisfaction is not as crushed as you might expect it would be. I think there's some, some element in which there's a certain amount of sympathy extended, if you like, to all of us who are in this situation. But the other thing that's affecting us in Australia is this whole set of other questions that have been bubbling in the background around the culture, the political culture in the Anglosphere, if you like, in which we are existing, and how that is playing through around questions that go to the really existential nature of universities, their autonomy, their independence, their role in delivering for the public interest. They are very interesting times here. And I'm glad that I'm an optimist. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And it's a remarkable story of a response under the challenge. But what you've said about research is chilling, and research so long to build it up and so easy to lose it, as a social function. And Australia is such an important research country. So much important work is done in Australia. And as you say, the effects of the pandemic and the hit on revenue in the research universities coincides with the Australia-China tensions and the Australia-China scientific collaboration, such a major collaboration in terms of volume and quality of work that's done, really important in world science, and as is the American-China collaboration. And both those major collaborative relationships are under threat, perhaps more so in the United States, but significantly now in Australia. So much to be concerned about. And of course, the rise of the state in our sector as well. And I mean, we need government when there's a great social crisis or economic crisis like we have now. We need government, but when government comes in to do more for us, it leaves a kind of lingering effect, and government stays around and perhaps gets the habit of intervention in sectors where it doesn't need to intervene. I better at this point bring in Laurie. Laurie Pearcey, another university as is Monash in the Shanghai Jiaotong Top 100, University of New South Wales in Sydney. Laurie is the Chief Executive Officer of UNSW Global Proprietary Limited and Pro Vice Chancellor International at UNSW. He's responsible for international student recruitment, quite a difficult gig at present, developing pathways, education, and advancing global business development. And prior to his appointment to his present post, Laurie was Executive Director International and led the development of UNSW's China and India strategies and helped to establish the Torch Innovation Precinct, which is a well-known initiative. Laurie.
Thanks very much, Simon, and really appreciate the invitation to join you here this afternoon / this evening, wherever in the world you may be. Well, as an avid Trekkie, I like to say that it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. Now that quote's erroneously attributed to Mr. Spock, although it was never actually used in Star Trek, but through the 1987 British song Star Trek, and it became part of the franchise's folklore. And I think, as Margaret just said, really throughout that really comprehensive presentation, for Australian universities, it's certainly far from life as we know it. Like just about everywhere else, Australia is staring down the barrel of a perfect hat trick of crises: a pandemic, a recession, and the most uncertain geopolitical environment, I would argue, since the erection of the Iron Curtain. Although Australia is far from alone in facing these turbulent times, it's an extraordinary test of resilience for a nation which has carried a reputation globally for a very long time, rightly or wrongly, as the lucky country. Largely on the back of Asia's insatiable demand for our bulk commodities, the great land down under has enjoyed 3 decades of uninterrupted economic growth. It hasn't come anything close to a public health crisis since the Spanish flu over a century ago, and its economic prosperity over those last 3 decades has largely been underwritten by the rise of China. There is barely a nation on earth that has had better innings than Australia. By virtue of her luck and indeed her ingenuity, Australia enters this period of uncertainty without recent experience of a major crisis to see it through to the other side. And prior to the pandemic, on paper at least, Australia's universities have never had it so good. The release of this year's AWU and CGHE rankings show that the nation's institutions of higher learning continue to be on a really remarkable trajectory. My own university, UNSW Sydney, we jumped 20 places in AWU to become 74th globally, and we went up another 4 places to 67th globally, following our 25 place rise last year in Times Higher Education. And the non-research intensives such as UTS and Macquarie are also doing incredibly well. Australia has more universities in the top 100 on a per capita basis than any other nation on earth, which is a pretty phenomenal achievement for a country that established its first university less than 2 centuries ago. Even more remarkable is that Australia has achieved this over recent decades on the back of consistent, chronic underinvestment in higher education by our state, and the nation's broader research ecosystem has been plagued by chronic underfunding from government. Gross expenditure on R&D has been on a slippery slope for years, and with investment languishing significantly below the OECD average of 2.37%, and the nation continues to record annual falls, and this has been happening over the last decade. Indeed, Australia's Productivity Commission has cited low investment in R&D as a major factor behind what it calls the country's mediocre gains in productivity. Australia's universities, and Margaret alluded to this, make a loss on every dollar received from competitive grant schemes across the spectrum in the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council. A little more than 1/3 of research conducted in Australia is financed by our taxpayers. Approximately 15% is funded by industry and philanthropy, with the balance, a staggering 51%, is funded by universities themselves. And that's largely the tuition fees paid by international students. So how could a nation with such an underwhelming track record of public investment in research and higher education achieve such an extraordinary performance in world university rankings? The answer lies, I think, in international education. The tyranny of distance and a small population has long isolated the great southern land, but we have always needed in our university system the flexibility to recruit staff and students from beyond our borders. My university recruited its first international students from Asia when we were just 3 years young in 1952. Australia was then in the depths of the White Australia policy. We operated a restrictive immigration system, and yet UNSW's founders believed in the importance of international students. In the 1960s, some 20% of our student body was international, which was something that was just about unheard of globally in those days. Australia's universities continued to trailblaze internationally into the 1980s and beyond. The then Labor government's move to allow universities to set open tuition fees in 1986 gave us the license to recruit international students in an open market. This then allowed us to pioneer commercial approaches to international student recruitment. The establishment of the recruitment agency IDP by Australia's universities is a case in point. To this day, our public universities retain a significant equity position in this global titan of international student recruitment. But as Australia entered the last decade of the 20th century, in 1990, there were just 25,000 international students in our borders. Today, that figure has grown to nearly 900,000, and international education is the fourth largest export earner after iron ore, coal, and gas. It generates $42 billion of export earnings, and it supports over 250,000 jobs in the wider economy, which is to say nothing about the network of diplomatic relationships, the people-to-people networks that international education forges across the region and beyond, which is fundamental to the development of Australia's major trading and economic relationships. And it's the rise of China that has become a major ingredient in the success story, with the Middle Kingdom accounting for nearly 40% of all international higher education enrolments across our country, who pay an average of somewhere like 30,000 Australian dollars per annum for the privilege of studying in Australia. But on a sleepy summer Saturday afternoon, as the nation was still emerging from the worst bushfire season in living memory, all of this was about to change. Australia's Prime Minister made an announcement that would shake universities to their core. The Chief Medical Officer advised the government that human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus was occurring in China and that Australia should close its borders to the People's Republic commencing on the 1st of February. Then slowly, as Vice-Chancellors and their leadership teams anxiously prepared for the start of the new academic year, the optimists heard the Prime Minister say that the border would be reassessed on a week-by-week basis, and some even held out hope that borders would open in time for students to enter the country and continue their studies. Universities across the sector raced to build content online. 10 years of innovation in some cases happened in the space of 10 days. But the border with China remained tightly shut, and then the Australian government closed its borders to all international arrivals, and they remain closed today. Yet this crisis has become about so much more than just closed borders. It has evolved into an all-out attack on our universities and our license to operate globally. Deliberately shut out from the nation's $70 billion plus furlough scheme and forecasting at least 21,000 job losses stemming from the budgetary impact of fewer international students, Australia's universities are now the subject of unprecedented legislation which will seriously impact our ability to engage internationally. Canberra's new Foreign Relations Bill will seriously impact the sector's ability to forge agreements internationally as the government seeks to deploy the diplomatic service to review and in some cases veto agreements with government agencies, publicly funded research institutes, and in some cases, universities which are deemed non-autonomous. And this legislation coincides with what some are arguing is the biggest breakdown in Australia's bilateral relationship with China, arguably in the history of our near 50-year diplomatic relationship. Universities have been placed squarely in the firing line, with Beijing issuing travel warnings to Chinese students, the Australian media and government backbenchers accusing vice-chancellors of giving in to Beijing's pressure on freedom of speech issues, and compromising national security through enabling unchecked participation by academics in flagship research capacity building schemes such as the 1,000 Talents Program and even the China Scholarship Council's doctoral training scheme. So where to from here? Many of our universities since the start of the pandemic have been following Simon's early analysis that it will take anywhere between 3 and 5 years for international mobility to return to their 2019 levels. A protracted diplomatic rift between Australia and its major trading partner could mean it takes more like 5. The reopening of borders early next year and a geopolitical normalisation, both in my view unlikely, would see a more optimistic assessment of student mobility levels into Australia. This is important. Although cultural capital continues to be invested in education across Asia, and this bodes well for the underlying demand for high quality university education, coronavirus is an economic wrecking ball wreaking havoc across major economies throughout the region. India, a place perceived to be the antidote to our exposure to a single source country, is in the depths of an economic and public health tragedy, and major ASEAN economies such as Indonesia and Malaysia are seeing GDP fall to levels unimaginable just months ago. This could mean that demand is ultimately less diverse as we seek to recover. I think that transnational education and offshore delivery will inevitably feature much more prominently in the university's internationalization agenda. Notwithstanding political tension, a once-in-a-century pandemic and closed borders, take-up of online courses by international students has so far exceeded expectations. My university has successfully recruited 4,000 full fee-paying international students since borders closed, which I think indicates a willingness to study online. Now, the $42 billion question for the lucky country is, are international students that are readily enrolling in online programs from overseas universities doing so because there is a belief that they are doing so temporarily and are counting on being able to get on a plane and complete onshore and have the full experience and the post-study work rights that comes with it? Or are they happy to save the living costs, remain in country and complete online? The answers to these questions will have profound consequences for the size and shape of Australia's universities for decades to come. For a nation which has produced 15 Nobel laureates and consistently ascended to the heights of world university rankings, now is our greatest time of resilience. Thank you very much.
Yes, stern and thoughtful words, Laurie, and many of us, I think, share your concerns, all of them, as you've expressed them. A lot of known unknowns, aren't there? I mean, we don't know about the pandemic's duration. We don't know about the ratio between online and face-to-face education in the next 2 or 3 years. We don't know about the translation of demand from one category to another and about the capacity of the sector to spring back and how quickly it'll spring back when the pandemic is nailed, as we hope it will be in the next 18 months, 2 years. And your points about the Australia-China relationship and the links between universities were chilling. I think that if you apply that non-autonomous concept rigorously, you would find that most universities in the research university category around the world have some kind of links with their national military through research mostly. I mean, say Caltech, for example, is heavily engaged in doing research for US defense and military. I mean, it's normal business for universities to have those links, and to apply that criterion selectively will be pretty unfair. At this point, I will now bring in our third speaker, my friend and colleague, Professor Fazal Rizvi, University of Melbourne. Fazal is one of the best known and most important scholars of global education in the world, and a really important creative force in social science in Australia. He was, prior to his period of work at the University of Melbourne, where I was a colleague of his before I left there in 2013, he was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the United States. He writes on identity and culture in transnational contexts, globalization and education policy, and is an expert on Australia-Asia relations. I could talk to you at length about his scholarship, about his key ideas, and about his major works, but I think the best thing to do will be to bring him in so he can explain to you himself what his ideas are. Thanks, Fazal.
Thank you, Simon. I am actually delighted to have been invited to join this august group of speakers and this seminar. I think it would not be too much of an exaggeration to suggest that COVID crisis has transformed the higher education landscape in Australia, as indeed it has elsewhere. Much has, of course, been said about the challenges of funding that the Australian universities now face. But equally, COVID has revealed the tensions that had already existed in the system it has accelerated and some other intricate trends that were evident already. So in many ways, COVID has had a multiplier effect, if you like, to the issues that we are talking about. Questions that had been set aside can perhaps now no longer be easily avoided. So for example, the issue of trust in public institutions was already something that Australians were talking about. But causes of distrust may now need to be interpreted in somewhat different way, but much more directly. Universities may now need to reimagine their complex relationship with the multiple publics they serve, both local and national, but also regional and international. Australian universities had already faced numerous problems of governance, such as those associated with casualization. They may now need to rethink issues of labor relations and the organization of academic work somewhat differently. In the post-COVID context, issues of student expectations and experiences and support might need to be revisited in new ways. Australian universities had already begun to experiment with online teaching and learning, though with a degree of reluctance by many academics. After COVID, that reluctance seems to have gone, and Australian universities now have an opportunity to reconsider how best to use the new technologies in reimagining teaching and learning, especially in the transnational space. And I want to suggest that in transnational space, there are additional problems in the use of technologies and online teaching and learning that we cannot avoid, especially in relation to surveillance of student material, student essays, and student ideas. With respect to internationalization, some very complex issues are emerging. To begin with, it is not at all clear how long it will take to recover the number of international students that we had in January this year. Australian higher education remains attractive to international students, but they may now return with a new set of expectations and perhaps a new set of demands, and we need to be conscious of what they are. At the same time, COVID has made it clear that Australian universities had become heavily dependent on revenue generated from international education, perhaps disproportionately so particularly from Chinese students. New South Wales Audit Office, for example, estimated that in 2018, something like 2/3 of the international student revenue came from Chinese students. Chinese students account for 60% of the combined international enrollment of Australia's G8 group of research-intensive universities. For quite some time, critics such as Babonis from IPA have been stressing the need for Australian universities to diversify. What they don't actually understand is that it would be wrong to say that Australian universities have not, in fact, been trying to do this, that is diversified, with bold recruitment efforts in South Asia, the Middle East, and South America. However, what has also become abundantly clear is that the demand for Australian higher education is simply not as great in those other regions as it is in China. So there is no prospect of returning to pre-COVID numbers without reliance on China. Okay, in other words, China is indispensable for any wish that we might have of getting back to similar numbers. Happily, research conducted by IDP has shown little reduction in demand for Australian higher education in China. Inquiries and applications remain about the same, if not higher levels as the previous years. Whether these applications will convert into actual acceptances remains to be seen. Also not clear is when the international border will reopen again, and if most of the students who left China in 2020 will resume their studies by returning here or by some other means. But much more serious issues also abound, not only recruitment, but something more than that. And it's the potential impact on Australian higher education about the problems that are now emerging in Australia-China relations, which have clearly deteriorated over the past 6 months during the period in which COVID has been such an active pain in the butt. Australia's decision to take a lead in calling for an inquiry into the origins of COVID did not please the Chinese authorities, which retaliated by discouraging Chinese students to consider Australia as a potential destination for higher education. While the Chinese authorities did not prevent students from coming to Australia or wanting to come to Australia, the mere possibility that they might do so sometime in the future clearly introduced a degree of uncertainty precisely at a time when Australian universities could ill afford it. Exactly how this drama might play itself out remains totally unpredictable, making financial planning even more grim than it normally is, not least because in the past it was predicated on an assumption of steady growth in income from Chinese students. The geopolitical tensions between China and Australia, following tensions between US and China, have serious consequences in a number of other ways. In my own experiences, the Chinese students in Australia have a very complicated relationship to the Chinese state. Many of them are intensely patriotic and resent media representations of Chinese history, society, and politics in Australia. They have also a deeply ambivalent relationship with the Chinese diaspora that already existed in Australia, with whom they at once deride on the one hand and wish to join as permanent residents simultaneously at the same time. We cannot assume that the experiences of Chinese students in Australia will not be unaffected by the emerging complexities of the China-Australia relationships. Already we know, and I know this from a project I did in 2015 with my colleague Fran Martin, that the Chinese students spend almost 2 hours each day, let me say that again, 2 hours each day on WeChat, Weibo, or TikTok. In other words, constantly being linked to China in a direct fashion, on a daily basis. In other words, their lives in Australia are no longer, can be assumed to be located entirely in Australia, but are transnational in a fairly significant and meaningful way on a daily basis. That means they have contemporary knowledge of China, and they have an understanding of China, and their expectations come from there. Exactly how the growing suspicions of data harnessing, surveillance, and the like, from their perspective, from the students' perspective, from the both sides, they believe surveillance takes place not only by the Chinese state, but also by the Australian states, might affect them is an issue that universities cannot ignore. In other words, we need to think much more about how the issue of surveillance and data harvesting, and indeed intrusion into looking at assignments, especially in the transnational space, is an issue that we cannot simply set aside. The students have a great deal, or the universities have a great deal to work on how we might discuss these issues with the students openly and make the students feel relatively uncomfortable in Australia when popular representations of the Chinese are mostly negative, often reviving the historical legacy and legacies of the yellow peril. And we've seen incidents of various kinds which have discomforted or made uncomfortable a number of Chinese students that I know personally myself. Now, the growing tensions between Australia and China also affect the possibilities of Australian students going on a study abroad program to China under the new Colombo plan. Recent publicity surrounding the hasty return of 2 Australian journalists and various scholars from China, and reciprocal activities and measures have created conditions that are not entirely conducive to the kind of people-to-people diplomacy that is intended under the New Colombo Plan. These tensions have also affected the potential of transnational research collaboration, which has been growing at a very rapid rate as far as Australia-China relationships has been concerned. For almost 2 decades, the Australian governments have encouraged Australian researchers and institutions to develop robust and strong research links and networks with their Chinese colleagues and institutions. The governments have invested large sums of money in supporting projects, largely in STEM areas, under the Australia-China Science and Research Fund, for example, among other programs. In other words, there has been a great deal that has been happening in the collaborative space. In July this year, China overtook the United States as Australia's leading research partner, with more Australian-led scientific publication involving researchers from China than any other country. This new analysis came as Australian universities faced a research funding crisis sparked by the loss of international student revenue. It should be noted that China too invests a great deal, almost $500 billion a year in research, that cash-starved Australian researchers cannot simply turn a blind eye to. But to accept the funds has its own difficulties, since there is a risk that local scientists will become increasingly reliant on Chinese resources, or they be left behind. This is a dilemma of an existential proportions for higher education, Australian higher education. In my view, one of the most important issues in relation to internationalization of Australian higher education in the next 10 years, or at least, will be really trying to resolve the difficulties surrounding Australia-China relations. Our hope is, of course, that these relationships will find some kind of even keel. But if they don't, then our internationalization efforts will invariably suffer. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Fazal. And there's a tremendous amount of content in all 3 presentations. And really, we needed a 2-hour time slot to handle this webinar. There's so much substance to it. And the transformation in Australia is on the order of, well, there's been nothing like it, I think, since World War II. I mean, the universities in World War II went through more than they're going through now, but what they're going through now is an immense, but that's true more broadly of the society as well. The economy, the civil society and the political space are all also undergoing unprecedented pressures and changes. I'm going to ask one question and then pass to William Locke, who'll ask the second question. My question is probably more for Margaret, perhaps than anyone else, but I don't mind who answers it. It's about the business model, which is much talked about, the business model of Australian universities. They're said to have made a mistake in adopting a business model where they've got a high degree of dependence on international students. Now, as a scholar of international education, my recollection is that the business model was created by the Australian government. The Australian government encouraged universities to recruit full fee paying students initially by creating a relatively permissive environment at immigration for student visas, and by giving the universities the capacity to charge whatever fee level they liked, and by simultaneously putting pressure on them by reducing their recurrent government funding. And the universities accordingly moved into this entrepreneurial zone and began to recruit. And you see the pattern really set by that. And ever since then, they've been increasing the proportion of their funding from international students. And that has allowed the government to run down its level of commitment to university financing through subsidies for domestic student places. Is that reading right, do you think? And is the government being unfair to talk about the business model? Or should I say that the business press and those in and around the government, are they being unfair to talk about the business model as being in some way flawed?
Well, I think it's perfectly clear that the government in 1986 had actually two competing reviews of international education, and it had two entirely different policy proposals in front of it in 1986, and it chose the one that now pertains for international education in Australia. I don't think that, now that proposal was very clear about what was intended, but it was not built on the notion that the government would therefore reduce its support for either research or for the funding of domestic students, that is of Australian citizens and residents. But governments chose to do that because Australian universities proved to be very successful in this space. So I don't know that the model was set up with the government understanding that it would provide what they seized as an opportunity. And therefore, I'd say two things. I'd say it's a very unusual criticism, particularly from many of the sources from which it comes, to suggest that the ability of, in this case, not-for-profit organisations to so successfully build their revenue, and all that revenue is going back into the enhancement of those institutions, into, as we know, significantly in the research intensives, into research. Australia would not have the world-class quality of research it has without that investment. Out of that so-called failed business model, I'm not sure that I see that as a failing. It would not have, and I'll just give you my own university as an example. All the new facilities, investments digitally and in education are basically all funded out of that fee stream. Domestic students would not have the cutting edge quality of innovation that they've been experiencing without that. So there was a significant enhancement for students, for research, for the Australian economy generally, because there was a significant benefit to the whole society. There was significant, as has been mentioned by Laurie before, the soft diplomacy, which is significant in links across the region. I don't call that a failed business model. I think I would be hard pressed to think of the number of industries in Australia that can produce 7 companies in the top 100 in the world. Well, not companies, but 7 organisations in the top 100 in the world, in which all the proceeds and surpluses are reinvested in the nation. And so I am disinclined to listen to what seems to be an unusual reading of an opportunistic decision by government to cut the funding which they should be providing for research and for citizens of Australia for their higher education, and to blame universities for the fact that they have been able to hold the system to the quality that it has through their own efforts, because we didn't build that international education industry, indeed without government support, but it was an industry very much forged by the action, if you like, of those institutions themselves.
Thanks, Margaret. I think the assumption that many people made when the international education sector took off in its current form was that universities were not particularly entrepreneurial, you know, that they were not particularly able in terms of business activity, but they proved to be able to quarantine their commercial sector, their international education sector, from their general operation in such a way as to remove any real tension between the two, but to then draw on the commercial side of the operation to subsidise the public good operation. And that, I mean, that you're right. I mean, that's been a very successful model.
What I would say, but I'm just going to add one thing if I can. The whole of Australia is dependent on export to China. Australian education is not more dependent on China than barley or wine or wool or much of our agricultural produce, or dare I say, our largest export, iron ore.
Yes.
The whole Australian economy is dependent. It is a very unusual discussion that is being had, which seems to be focused on the fact that this sort of engagement with China is of a different sort and is not, if you like, a disembodied commodity.
It's
still a real people. Mm.
It's still a little strange that economic rationales and economic concerns have been put aside so easily in this geopolitical environment, that politics and identity have just taken over completely, it seems, from other criteria in decision making. I think we've got time for one question, and I'm going to have to apologise to Sanal Singh and Mohammed Mogadam, because we're not going to get time for you at this time. Please come back to our next webinar and I'll ensure that you get into the question list. The question that we do have time for is William Locke. William, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to be fairly brief.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's very nice to see my colleagues from here in Australia. And thank you very much, the three of you, for very stimulating and distinctive and in many ways complementary contributions. Slightly strange that we're communicating via a seminar in the UK, but then anyway, that's the nature of the world now. Also slightly strange because I also gave evidence to the Senate hearing this morning, or lunchtime I think it was. So I was watching Margaret on the computer earlier on, just trying to get a sense of the feeling of the room, which was very helpful. Anyway, my question is this. Why do you think the federal government appears, this is the coalition of Nationals and Liberals, appears to have taken the opportunity of COVID-19 to hit the universities with, and this is just three examples, exclusion from the JobKeeper payment, which is the equivalent of the furlough scheme in the UK, the counter-foreign interference strategy, and the job-ready graduates reforms, which will reduce teaching funding by 6%. Is there some kind of hidden agenda behind all of this?
I'm going to ask Laurie to answer that because we don't have time for a full round of final responses from the three. And perhaps Fazal can have the last word after Laurie's spoken. Laurie.
Thanks, Simon, and great to connect with you, William. Look, I think in relation to your question, if there's some kind of alternative ideological agenda, I might simply say that, well, you might think that very well indeed. I couldn't possibly comment. I think in relation to JobKeeper, the government moved specifically to legislate Australia's universities out of the JobKeeper scheme. I spent probably a good 4 weeks of my life this year knee deep in the legislation that went through the National Parliament in relation to JobKeeper, because in addition to my university role, I'm the chief executive of a wholly owned subsidiary of the university, which, because it is a separate entity registered in its own right with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, we are in fact eligible for the JobKeeper subsidy. And I think, and Margaret will correct me if I'm wrong, but Monash College, which is Monash's pathway provider, is similarly eligible here as well. I think that the government, if you look at its public commentary, they've been very frank in their assessment that in their view, Australia's universities' #1 demand was that they would have their Commonwealth supported placements guaranteed for 2021, irrespective of actual student demand, and that at the outset of the pandemic, Australian universities didn't ask for anything else, and the Commonwealth happily obliged and gave Vice-Chancellors everything it was that they were asking for, which I think is a rather extraordinary simplification of the efforts of Australia's university Vice-Chancellors to talk to the federal government. Some would argue that that there is a camp within the coalition. And if you look at the backbenches of the coalition government, there is a camp that doesn't look very kindly towards Group of 8 research-intensive universities. That's not my view. That's a view that's been expressed by a range of media commentators, and some would posit that the government doesn't look very kindly on on Australian universities and their business models. But we've just had a very good discussion about Australian universities and their business models. But I think that the broader element of that is for others to. I'll leave for others to comment. But Simon, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks again, Laurie, and thanks very much for your contribution today. Fazal, we've reached the end. I think that we usually quit at this point. I want to thank all three of you for staying up late, for giving us so much, so quickly and so well. And we are all watching and with concern and with interest on how you handle this existential challenge, as Margaret said. Our next webinar is going to be about the pandemic, higher education, and East and Southeast Asia. And we're going to look at Japan, China, and Malaysia. And that webinar takes place in 2 days' time, 2 to 3 p.m. in the UK. And we look forward to everyone's participation then. Fazal, some closing remarks from you, if you can.
Point that I really wanted to re-emphasize is there are two ways to look at Australia-China relationships. One at the level of international relations. The other one is the ways in which international relations affect our Chinese students in our own universities. In other words, we really have to understand how it is that they are interpreting and negotiating the complexities that are emerging. And that really is the point that I'm trying to make. I think the Chinese students are going to be indispensable to Australian higher education. They will continue to come because the demand is so great. I don't think they will be prevented by the state in any. However, the ways in which we talk about the tensions will affect them in ways direct and indirect. And we need to keep our eyes on that and to understand how it is that we work with them to ensure that they feel not as part of the problem rather than as something that are indispensable to our communities.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Fazal, for the way you brought in not just teaching and learning issues, but human issues, and you acknowledged and talked about at length the living situation and cultural positioning of Chinese students in Australia. That was really important. And international education is about people. That's why we do it. That's why we do higher education. It's about people and their development and their sharing and their formation. Thanks very much to all three of you. It's been a delight for me personally to work with the three of you today, and look forward to our next opportunity to speak. We'll see everyone soon, I hope in 2 days' time, to discuss the equally weighty issues of the pandemic and higher education in East and Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.